Welcome everyone to Sunday School here at Upper Room Ministries. We're so glad you've joined us today. We are continuing in our study of the prophecies of the Bible, what has come to pass and what has not. Last time we began our study of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah, in case you don't know, is the longest book of the four major prophetic books of the Old Testament. Therefore, I believe that this is the book we're going to be spending the most time on in this series. Which means after we're finished, it's all downhill from there. Yeah? Isn't that good? Okay, so let's get started. We last left off in chapter 4 of Isaiah. We had completed prophecy 1508. Chapter 4 covers prophecies that have not yet come to pass, but will in the millennial kingdom. Let's first look at verse number 2. Verse 2 talks about, in that day shall the branch of the Lord be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and comely for them that are escaped of Israel. This is prophecy 1509, talking about how beautiful Israel is going to be in the millennial kingdom, and it also addresses the remnant that will survive the battle of Armageddon. This remnant is also mentioned in the book of Zechariah, chapter 13, verses 8 and 9. And then we move to verses 3 and 4, prophecy 1510. In these verses, it talks about how the remnant will be saved after the wrath of God comes during the second coming. Specifically, in verse 4, it talks about the Lord having washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion, and shall have purged the blood of Jerusalem from the midst thereof by the spirit of judgment and by the spirit of burning. We had addressed the filth of the daughters of Jerusalem in the previous episode. If you want to reread those verses, it's chapter 3, verses 16 through 26. Right. Verse 5 talks about how God will create a dwelling place on Mount Zion, and upon her assemblies a cloud of smoke by day, and the shining of a flaming fire by night. Now, you go back and read Exodus chapter 13, verses 20 through 23. This same imagery was used to describe the presence of God amongst the children of Israel. Cloud of smoke and flaming fire, actually a pillar of fire. So it sounds like come the millennial kingdom, God's presence will be seen exactly how the children of Israel saw it. And that's prophecy 1511. Verse 6, prophecy 1512, says, And there shall be a tabernacle for a shadow in the daytime from the heat, and for a place of refuge. This could mean a literal building, because it talks about shade from the heat and shelter from storm and from rain. The tabernacle of God is also referenced in Revelation chapter 21, verse 3. However, it could also be a symbolic reference to the very presence of God. Psalm 91. The psalmist writes how the Lord God is his fortress and his refuge. Okay, chapter 5. Chapter 5 is a song that Isaiah sings, talking about describing God as the vine dresser and Israel as his vineyard. Let's read verse 1. It says, "Now will I sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard." Did any of you recognize those words? My beloved and vineyard. You should, because those very words were used in the Song of Solomon, where the Shulamite bride addresses her lover as her beloved, and that he tends a vineyard. It again adds credibility to the belief that the Song of Solomon is symbolic. It symbolizes the relationship between Christ, God, and his people. Anyway, in verse 2, Isaiah sings about everything that God did to protect it and to make it grow, to make it prosper. And at the end of verse 2, it says, "And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes." I believe wild grapes refers to the influence of outside world. They wanted a king, like every other country did, and they also brought in foreign idols into the country. Idolatry was something that absolutely incensed God. He spoke about it through his prophets many, many times. And so, we move to the first prophecy of chapter 5. Starting in verse 5, this is prophecy 15:13, where God states, "I will take away the hedge thereof, and it shall be eaten up, and break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden down." For those who have studied the book of Job, Satan talks about the hedge of protection God had surrounding Job, and the only way Satan was able to touch Job as if that hedge of protection was taken down. Well, here we see the hedge will come down, which will allow foreign invaders to invade Judah and absolutely trample on it, which did happen when the Babylonians, led by Nebuchadnezzar, invaded. Then verse 6, it talks about the desolation of Judah after the invasion. It even says, "I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it." So, not only is there going to be desolation, but there's going to be no recovery, at least until God says there's going to be a recovery. They were held in captivity for 70 years, but they eventually came out. So, that's prophecy 15:14. Moving on through the chapter, Isaiah begins to prophesy woes on various groups of people. Starting in verse 8, these are woes for the covetous people. Verse 9, prophecy 15:15, talks about those who possess many, many houses. They are going to be empty and desolate. And furthermore, in verse 10, it talks about those who own much farmland, many vineyards. They will produce few crops. And of course, that all came to pass after the invasion. Okay, and then verses 11 through 17, Isaiah addresses the drunkards. Particularly the ones who believe in just life's all about eating and drinking and being merry. Verse 12 certainly goes into that detail, where it says, "And the harp and the viol and the tabret and pipe and wine are in their feasts, but they regard not the work of the Lord, neither consider the operation of his hands." This reminds me of the parable Jesus taught about the rich fool who had such an abundant crop that he had no room to store it, so he planned to tear down his barns, build bigger ones, and intended to live easy for the rest of his life, saying, I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry. In other words, he wasn't going to do any more work. He was just going to live for pleasure. And God said, you fool, this very night you will die. Then who will get it all? So anybody who lives only for pleasure is really talking themselves into an early grave. That's just how it is. That's how it is in Isaiah. And I believe that's how it is for today also. Then we go down to verse 14. This is the first prophecy, prophecy 15:17. It says, hell has enlarged herself and opened her mouth without measure, and their glory and their multitude and their pomp, and he that rejoices shall descend into it. This is the ultimate fate for people who seek only to live for pleasure and for drunkenness. Verses 15, 16, and 17 are also judgments that will fall upon the drunkards. These are prophecies 15, 18 through 15, 20. Verse 15 talks about the mighty men shall be humbled. Verse 16, the Lord of hosts shall be exalted in judgment. And 17 talks about how the lambs shall feed after their manner, and the waste places of the fat ones shall strangers eat. What that means is that human habitations would become pastures for animals. All of which came to pass when judgment fell. All right, then we skip ahead to verse 24. This verses 24 and 25 talks about Judah being abandoned to judgment. And in verse 25 it says, their carcasses were torn in the midst of the streets. So after the Babylonian invasion, there will be dead corpses all throughout the streets of Jerusalem. Verses 26 through 30 describe the Babylonian invaders themselves and what they're going to be like. It says, verse 26, and he will lift up an ensign to the nations from far. That's prophecy 15:22, talking about Babylon. Then in verse 27, it says, none shall slumber nor sleep, neither shall the girdle of their loins be loosed, nor the latchet of their shoes be broken. It means these soldiers are going to be ready for war. They're going to take this job with the utmost seriousness. That's prophecy 15:23. Then in verse 28, it talks about the weapons and the chariots. It says the arrows are sharp, all the bows bent, and the wheels of their chariots like a whirlwind. Means these men aren't going to be coming in on wobbly wheeled chariots. No, these chariots are going to be swift, and they're going to be fast, and their weapons are going to be ready to kill. Those are prophecies 15:24 and 15:25. Lastly, verse 29, it says, their roaring shall be like a lion, they shall roar like young lions, they shall roar and lay hold of the prey. That's prophecy 15:26. They're going to come roaring, which makes me think about how Satan is described as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, which leads me to believe that quite possibly these Babylonian forces will be demonically influenced. I don't know that for certain, but it's certainly possible. After all, the devil certainly wanted Israel destroyed from the beginning. All right, chapter 6. This is the chapter where Isaiah actually enters into the throne room and sees God, and he says, woe unto me, for I am undone, I am a man of unclean lips, and one of the seraphims cleanses his lips with a coal, and God then approves him, calls him cleansed. And then in verse 8 it says, I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here I am, send me. So right now, Isaiah has already delivered a number of prophecies on behalf of God. But now he's receiving a new commission, one that God actually called him up to his throne room. So what is this commission? And in verse 9, we see it. This is prophecy 15:27. Hear ye, go and tell this people, hear ye indeed, but understand not, and see ye indeed, but perceive not. Basically, God is telling Isaiah, go and tell them that in spite of all the warnings they're going to get, they simply aren't going to accept it, they aren't going to understand it, and judgment is going to fall. And this was actually quoted in Matthew chapter 13, verses 14 and 15. So this state of stubbornness for Israel and their refusal to heed any warnings from God didn't just come to pass prior to the Babylonian invasions, but it also came to pass prior to the crucifixion of Christ and the rejection of Him as the Messiah. And then go down to verse 11, and I said, Lord, how long? And He answered, until the cities be wasted, without inhabitant, and the houses without man, and the land utterly desolate. That's 15:28. So He was to keep on preaching until the Babylonians, and keep on speaking until the Babylonians invaded, and everything was left desolate, which did happen. And then verse 13, it says, but yet shall be a tenth, and it shall return. And that's prophecy 15:29. Talks about, again, that's in reference to the remnant that will return to Jerusalem and Judah, and to rebuild it again. Chapter 7. All right. In verses 1 through 6, talk about an attempted invasion by kings Rezin of Syria and Pekah of Israel, which is also Israel is often referred to as Ephraim in Isaiah, because Ephraim was the lead tribe of the 10 tribes of Israel. And these two kings tried to invade Jerusalem, but could not. And now there's talk of a confederacy between both nations. And Israel is in a panic right now about this confederacy. But the Lord commissions Isaiah to meet with Ahaz in verse 3. And it says, go forth now to meet Ahaz, thou, and Shear-Jashub, thy son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pole in the highway of the fuller's field. So he's telling Isaiah to bring his son, Shear-Jashub, with him. And that name, Shear-Jashub, means a remnant shall return, which is his son's name is actually a sign for a fulfillment of the prophecy of a remnant returning to Israel after the Babylonian captivity. All right. Now Isaiah speaks to Ahaz, starting in verse 7. Prophecy 15:30. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. Now this is talking about this alliance between Syria and Israel. The alliance won't stand, and their plans to invade won't come to pass. Further, and then in verse 8, prophecy 15:31, it talks about Ephraim, which is Israel, being broken in 65 years. This would all come to pass in 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 7 through verse 41, by the way. But then in verse 9, it's Isaiah also says to Ahaz, if ye will not believe, surely ye shall not be established. That's prophecy 15:32. Isaiah is saying, if you don't believe the word of God, if you don't believe these prophecies, then neither you shall survive. And it turns out Ahaz didn't believe, because in verses 10-11, Isaiah tells Ahaz to ask God for a sign, any kind of sign to confirm that what he has spoken shall come to pass. And look what Ahaz says in verse 12. I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. Now that sounds pious, but in truth that is false piety. By saying I will not tempt the Lord, what he's really saying is I'm not even going to bother asking for a sign, because he has no faith in God. None. And Isaiah says in response, well, he says, if you're not going to ask for a sign, then the Lord shall choose a sign. And that sign is given in verse 14. This is prophecy 15:33. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. That, of course, is in reference to the Christ child, thus coming to pass in Matthew 1, verse 18, where he is called Emmanuel. Now, butter and verse 15, this is prophecy 15:34. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose good. Butter and honey, that's just typical baby food. And Isaiah is prophesying that by the time he's able to eat butter and honey, by the time he's starting to eat food, he shall already know how to discern good from evil, and will always choose good. So this is talking about the sinlessness of this child. And lastly, in verse 16, Isaiah says, before the child shall know how to refuse evil, both the kings, both Kings Rezin and King Pekah will be destroyed. So prior to the Messianic birth, these kings will be destroyed. And those kings were destroyed in 2 Kings 15 and 16. But now dealing with Ahaz, because he refused to believe, his fate is laid out in verse 17, where it talks about a great catastrophe that hasn't been seen since Judah and Israel separated during Solomon's days. Okay, and this would come to pass in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verses 1 through 15. Okay, moving on in verses 18 through 19. This describes an invasion by both Assyria and Egypt. Both shall invade. All right, and then verse 20 it talks about the clean destruction that that Egypt and Assyria will leave after they've invaded. And it says, "In that same day shall the Lord shave with a razor." Means everything is going to be wiped out. Actually, the desolation is described all throughout verses 20 through 25. But I should point out in verses 21 and 22, this also talks about a remnant. Verse 21, it says, "And it shall come to pass in that day that a man shall nourish a young cow and 2 sheep." So not everybody will in Judah will be killed or taken into captivity. There'll be some remaining, but it's going to be so small that a young cow and 2 sheep would be enough to sustain them. So this is a very, very small remnant of people. Okay, chapter 8. Starting in verse 1, "Moreover, the Lord said unto me, Take thee a great roll, and write in it with a man's pen concerning Maher Shalal Has-Habaz." That would be the name of Isaiah's second son. So God is telling him, you're going to have a second son. Write it down, and write down the name, because this is the name you're going to use. And then in verse 3, he and his wife had that second son. And he received that name. Mahas, whatever. Sorry. That's actually tied. That name is actually tied for the longest name in the Bible. He's tied with the author of Psalm 56. If you want to know that name, just read the heading of Psalm 56. Okay? All right. And then Isaiah begins to describe what's going to happen in regards to his own son. Starting in verse 4, it says, "Before my son will be able to say father or mother, Damascus and Syria will be plundered by the king of Assyria." And this would come to pass in 2 Kings chapter 16 verse 7 through chapter 17 verse 41. Okay, prophecy 15:42. Verse 8, and this is also talking about, "And Assyria not only will invade Damascus and Samaria, but it will also invade Judah." And this would come to pass, 2 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 16. One more prophecy, and then we'll wrap it up for today. Prophecy, verses 9 through 12. Judah had been depending on the help of other countries to keep them safe and not God. And here Isaiah is prophesying all the alliances they've made will not last, and they don't. Okay, well that concludes this week's session. We shall pick up in chapter 8 next time. Thank you.